Conflicts of interest in organizations. My goodness, that's a very topical issue, because with evolving procurement laws, evolving financial acts, evolving codes of ethics, sometimes you're not even too sure which one is the conflict, which one is not the conflict. Recently, in a famous country called Ghana, a man committed something like maybe $8 million to the purchase of a particular property for an organization. Now, this man had previously worked for that organization and authorized the purchase. So people raised issues of conflict of interest. And his argument was that he declared his interests, told them he had worked for the company before, excluded himself from all the processes that led up to the submission of bids, vetting, final approval, and that all he did as CEO was approve the final purchase. It looks like the jury is out on whether or not that's conflict of interest. But since it's not a fairly contentious issue, I want to spend some time looking at this whole issue of conflict of interest. And in this particular session, what I'm going to try and do is I will speak to why the issue is important, what forms it can take, how to disclose conflicts of interest, implications of these sorts of disclosures, and some recommendations on how to manage conflicts of interest in whatever organization you find yourself domiciled in. So when the session is all and done, I'm going to try and explain to you how these conflicts look like, the various forms, and the implications for managing businesses better in Ghana and Africa as a whole. So let me start with some basic definitional issues. What is conflict? Well, conflict is generally some sort of disagreement or contestation between people with some opposing needs, some opposing beliefs, some opposing values, or some opposing goals. So conflict is disagreement. Conflict is contrast. So a conflict of interest is a situation where some employee of a public sector, private sector, or third sector organization has a private or personal interest in a matter that is likely to influence or appear to influence the objective exercise of any aspect of his or her duties. Let me repeat the definition. A conflict of interest is a situation where an employee has a private or personal interest that is likely to influence or appear to influence the objective exercise of any aspect of his or her duties. Now, conflicts of interest are legal and social phenomena that go back way to the beginning of civilization. Now, when you are trying to determine a conflict of interest in an organization, it should be decided whether personal interest could interfere or appear to interfere with an employee's objective judgment when it comes to the discharge of their duties. So a perceived conflict of interest is one in which a reasonable person will consider it likely for objectivity to be compromised. Perceived conflict of interest is one in which a reasonable person would consider it likely for objectivity to be compromised. Now, a potential conflict of interest is a situation that could develop into an actual or perceived conflict of interest. Now, a perceived conflict of interest usually occurs when the situation points to the fact that there is a high probability that the individual or group of people involved will have competing interests. So an actual conflict of interest happens when a situation or an action has been established as conflicting, usually one that has not been disclosed. A financial conflict of interest is a situation in which there is an opportunity for an individual to assume financial gain, either from the individual, either for the individual or for friends or relatives. Now, financial conflict of interest is a big issue. And it's something that could easily ensnare the very best of people. So, especially in public sector organizations like where I work, in the university I work, and other ministries, departments, and agencies, it is very prudent to ensure that we all keep abreast with the evolving demands of the work we do in terms of financial administration acts, codes of ethics that govern our work, the way we file taxes, and so on and so forth. Because sometimes conflict of interest can take even the best people totally unawares. Now, it will be reasonable for another party to assume that the possibility of financial benefits in the form of payments of services, equity interest, hospitality, gifts can affect any individual's actions towards a particular business transaction. So try very hard to ensure that you don't fall into perceived conflict of interest situations, or indeed into actual conflict of interest situations, especially when they pertain to financial conflict of interest. So a non-financial conflict of interest will occur if a situation might provide or is seen by other people to possibly provide a potential incentive to the individual that will affect his or her actions and then affect the decisions of the organization. So non-financial conflicts of interest may also occur in relation to an individual's obligations to an organization, and such non-financial interest could include maybe a direct or indirect improvement of an individual's career, some benefit to an immediate family member or person with whom the individual has a close personal relationship. So, in managing conflicts of interest, identifying and disclosing such dilemmas has been stressed as a very vital step in addressing the situation. So, most human capital, human resource policies on conflicts of interest have procedures that must be followed to disclose conflicts of interest. Now, these procedures differ from industry to industry, and they usually differ from organization to organization. Please, let me stop here and stress again that whether you're a student watching this video, or you are currently a practicing manager, whether you work in a not-for-profit, public sector, private sector institution, I want to strongly admonish at this point that you take your time to visit your human resource policies, human resource manual again, and study particularly the areas pertaining to conflicts of interest. Because like I said at the beginning of this lecture, even the best people have been compromised sometimes because they were totally unaware of the procedural steps to take to ensure that they don't get ensnared by this famous trap, conflict of interest. Now, in a situation where an employee is involved in discussing an issue at a formal meeting, the employee must announce that he or she has an interest in the matter being discussed before the issue is deliberated. In other situations, the matter should be raised and discussed with a relevant party, with a relevant person, as soon as the conflict of interest is identified. So what am I saying? I'm saying here that, look, in certain situations, my friends in human capital, human resources management, you could also assist in prompting an employee to potential conflict of interest situation, because when that employee is walking into a conflict of interest trap, they may be unaware. Sometimes they may not be aware of what procedure to follow. In those situations, please, human capital, you can come to the aid of that person so they don't get trapped by conflict of interest problems and then have to suffer the consequences. Now, whilst I've been doing these admonitions, also sort of important to balance the discussion a bit, because conflict of interest situations do not necessarily imply wrongdoing. Though they can be viewed as criminal sometimes, depending on how the party involved goes about disclosing or failing to disclose a potential conflict. And you see, conflict of interest, trust me, they can have some very telling consequences on the conduct of organizational business. Somebody who gets trapped in conflict of interest and walks into the trap unknowingly can have very serious issues with the way they perform after that catastrophic event. So conflict of interest could adversely affect employee performance. It's something that we need to all take cognizance of, that the ramifications of that conflict of interest don't relate only to the organization as a corporate entity, but whichever employee gets ensnared in the conflict of interest trap can have very disastrous consequences on their own performance and productivity within the organization. Flowing naturally from what I've just said, organizational productivity and organizational profitability can also be affected adversely when conflict of interest issues are not managed in a timeous and a certain efficacious manner. Now, HR departments should create rules. Human resource departments should create rules for the most vital and obvious actions that people must take or not take in relation to conflicts of interest. So organizations should, for instance, establish mechanisms for having a register for recording personal interest that may give rise to a conflict of interest, and develop a process for putting this into effect and updating it on a regular basis. Let me give you an example, for instance, of where conflicts of interest can arise, and sometimes even the best people may not want to disclose it. Let's say, for instance, I am an external examiner to a particular institution. Because of some record-keeping anomalies, the National Accreditation Board of a particular country writes to me to say, "Hi, Professor Henson, we want you to go to University X to go and do an appraisal or a vetting or lead an accreditation team to that particular institution because they want to introduce a particular master's or PhD in maybe marketing analytics." Because of the lure of money and the attraction of pecuniary gain, I can decide to not disclose my interest in that particular university, lead the team, go accredit them, and probably get away with it or not. The proper thing to do is to say, "Hi, National Accreditation Board, please, I am an examiner, I am an advisor, I am a part-time professor, I have something to do with that institution, and therefore I cannot go as part of an accreditation team because there are clear conflicts of interest. I cannot go and be a referee in a match where I'm part of the teams that are actively engaged in trying to score each other." I think it creates problems. And these are just little examples I want to give, because sometimes we must take a decision as professionals or as students to just avoid these situations, even though I am proposing that the human resources team in any organization should lead the charge to ensure people don't get ensnared when it comes to conflict of interest situations. Now, it's also important to develop a strategy from the human capital perspective for identifying and disclosing occurrences of conflicts of interest as and when they occur. And I think employees, workers should all be educated on how to disclose a conflict of interest and to whom such issues should be reported to in the organization. Just yesterday, in the organization in which I work, there was a full seminar on ethics and related issues when it comes to how to conduct yourself in that university. And it's very illuminating to the extent that once you understand do's and don'ts, then you are clear on what constitutes a breach of the law and what doesn't. So you are advised on how to conduct yourself. And I think organizations should create such platforms for training and also for handling complaints or breaches of certain policies, and should specify potential consequences of violating rules. Now, how do we establish a company's ethical culture? Well, we can do it by No, stop. So that's the end. I didn't end properly. Okay, so can I say something to end? Well, thank you very much for listening to this exposition of conflicts of interest. I pray that as you watch, we'll develop a certain solid awareness of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And again, I want to close by speaking to my human capital brothers and sisters again that please make sure there are clear frameworks for what constitutes conflict of interest or not. And make sure everybody who works in the organization knows exactly what's expected of them so they are not ensnared by a conflict of interest. Thank you for listening, and I'll come back your way again very, very soon. Thank you.